Alright, as we continue to catch up on the kind of last part of this year and the awards contenders we haven't talked about yet, of course, we can talk about Power of the Dog, as well as a couple of others, one of which is clearly not in any kind of awards contention that I'm aware of, and the other may or may not be depending on its campaign process. But let's start with Power of the Dog. And to start with Power of the Dog, I think something that needs to be said is I had I had watched it at first, like when it first came out, and then I saw it again when it hit Netflix, and then I saw it one more time, just kind of through because the availability, but also this is one of those movies where it's unless it just really speaks to you, I think, and you immediately kind of get into it. It kind of took the number of times that I saw it to really grasp exactly what it was doing. It's one of those movies where I could see a lot of people seeing it once and thinking that like just not a lot is happening, which I get. Um, but by the time you see it the third time, there's like almost too much to unravel. But I mean that in the best way possible. So in order to go through that, I think we're gonna have to do what we did with the last Benedict Cumberbatch movie we just talked about, and that is just put a whole giant spoiler thing right here and just kind of go through the whole thing. Because there's other things that we could kind of dance around here, but I feel like it wouldn't quite be doing justice what all can be talked about with this movie. So we're just gonna do the whole thing with all the spoilers intact. So I'm just gonna leave that here. So if you haven't seen this, this is probably something you don't want to hear, at least to the full extent. So now that that warning is out there, I think we can go into it. The first thing that I've seen debated a lot is how you put it into a genre, which will not be the last time we ask that question in this video. But as far as this goes, it clearly has, the Western setting. And I guess they've been saying that it's technically classified as a Western, but clearly not in the traditional sense by any means whatsoever. I was trying to remember if there's even a gun on screen in it. There's never a gun fired in it. But like if there is one, it's just there as like a background prop practically. But still, there is a bit of warring here, the kind of war that you would see between characters in, a western that would typically face off in like Main Street or something. Um, but what's also interesting about this is when you do see it more than once, it's really there's so much of a transformation for most of the characters. Probably about half of the characters go through a pretty big transformation, and the other two more or less remain the same in very interesting ways. Also, especially given what story's going on around them. But it's still wild to finish this movie and then go back to the beginning and watch it over again, and it's how you really see how completely different some of the characters are by the end of the movie versus where they started. And you can see the characters through a totally different light. Once you see this movie once, the way you view those characters when it starts, you will never see them that way ever again. Like, it is strictly just the first time you see the movie, you'll see them this way, and then every time you watch the movie, then you will only see the characters that everything that is lurking underneath. And obviously, you can say that about any movie, but I mean, and it's really particular in this case, just how incredibly different the characters might feel once you know what's already lurking underneath and know all of their ins and outs and what it is that they're hiding. Because this is one of those movies also where things very gradually come to light that almost make characters see like they never change their ways on screen, but knowing what you know about them personally, it's like the complete opposite of the way you initially like they're the complete opposite of the person that they seem to come off as throughout it. Like a lot of identity stuff going on in this movie in particular. But I guess to start with what kind of sets everything off would be this pairing of Kirsten Dunst and Jesse Plemons, and the whole relationship they have compared to the relationship that Plemons and Cumberbatch have, which is obviously brother relationship. And one of the things they just immediately do really well, like it's one of those cases where it's not really like setting out to do this to the point that you're aware this is exactly what the movie wants you to feel. It just does it so naturally. Is that whole feeling of like just using feeling, it articulates this whole thing of when you are in that situation where you're like really close to somebody and that person is really close to somebody that you couldn't be farther away from emotionally and otherwise, and how you have that sort of it's how you have one connecting person with somebody that you're on a completely different planet from, um, and you immediately get like that really familiar feel, like it's this sort of almost anxiety inducing feeling, in the way they portray that so seamlessly in regards to what's going on between Dunst and Cumberbatch here, because Dunst and Cumberbatch don't have a lot of screen time, but it's really kind of this is like the battle that, like this almost sort of Western battle that you imagine, where you have one side versus another side. But then Cosmo Murphy kind of comes in and sort of takes the place of Dunst in this battle, but that's a whole other thing also, that we'll go into, that has a lot of different ins and outs that really kind of takes that concept in general. And while you can say that's the initial setup to it, there's a lot of different ways you can look at it also, and a lot of different interpretations different people might have also. Um, I hope that this doesn't sound too jumbled. I hope I'm trying not to confuse myself, and hopefully to God not confusing you in the process also. But that's just how many sort of layers are going on here and all the stuff to put together. So yeah, but to talk about the relationship between Plymouth and Dunst first, what's also really interesting is the idea that they've been a couple in real life for some time now, and they have a couple of children together now. And the interesting thing about that, and I heard Dunst talk about this a little bit, was the idea that one of the problems that they faced was the fact that the Plymouth and Dunst characters have to kind of meet formally for the first time in this and kind of establish a connection that kind of has a lot of distance in it at first because it's a new thing. And they had to fight around the familiarity that they have with each other. So you go into it and you think, oh, you guys have to play a married couple. Like, that's hard. But yeah, we see the process of how they become a married couple from the beginning. So there are moments where they kind of have to have that uncomfortable distance and that whole thing where they kind of feel like strangers that are kind of somewhat, the feelings are kind of creeping in when they talk to each other. Um, and then this ultimately adds up to beautiful scenes we have, like when she teaches Plemons how to dance and he has to break away from her because he's kind of overwhelmed in that very understated way that Jesse Plemons can really do well. Like I've heard complaints a lot about how Jesse Plemons basically does the same thing, which how how anybody can say like this character and Todd from Breaking Bad and the guy in Game Night are all the same, just feel like the same person. I don't know how these people who say this view people. But no, I feel like Jesse Plemons has a lot going on in the range department for sure. And that shows here also where like he is, it seems to be him especially that really carries the idea of how understated the movie itself is, because obviously Cumberbatch is a very showy performance and Dunst has a very very showy performance, but the movie's so incredibly understated, and much in the way that Plemons' performance is and his character is, and Cosmo McPhee also, that it's Plemons and Cosmo McPhee that I feel like kind of set us up tonally for what's going on in this really interesting way. But yeah, but then when we see those moments when he actually has some emotion and he like gets overwhelmed by the fact that he's just happy that like he's not alone and stuff like that really hits. And it's one of those cases where we have like these, because everything is so understated and because everybody's identities are so suppressed, that when somebody actually like kind of shows emotion, it's like even if it's really understated, it feels big in the moment, which is and what this whole cast pretty much accomplishes throughout in various different ways, because we got a lot of different sort of characters that are interacting here. as far as Cumberbatch goes, I had heard a lot of stuff going in with this performance. I had heard, first of all, that it was divisive, and some people thought it was the best work of his career. Some people thought he was miscast, and I can see that. I can see where the division might be. I do think Cumberbatch is accused of being miscast more than he deserves, because I feel like I hear that a lot whenever he's just in something. Like everything from Black Mass, which I kind of get, being Johnny Depp's brother, and then like The Grinch. I guess I can get that, but I still Cumberbatch is still an actor that I really really love, and I find really exciting to see like the choices he'll make and stuff like that. And here, getting this character that was kind of getting compared to Daniel Plainview at the time that first came out, which is something I can see as well. But the idea that he's playing with a whole identity thing here, because that's the thing is it seems like a lot of this movie hinges on how you feel about the Cumberbatch character throughout. Where like if you really despise him and like just loathe every time he's on screen, he's doing his job right for the first half, and he's got to somehow get you away from that. Like when you look at, you know, talking about Daniel Plainview, the Day-Lewis performance in There Will Be Blood, which obviously is one of the greatest performances of all time, but it's you kind of feel a constant way about Daniel Plainview. Whereas with Cumberbatch, he's got this really difficult job of making you really. Because I could see, like, a more cynical person getting to a certain point in this movie where you start to realize we're supposed to look at Phil a little differently and kind of see the things underlying about his identity. And a more cynical viewer might say, really, this guy, you want us to see more dimensions of? This guy's a piece of shit. Like this. But that's the thing is he finds that way where we get there, and he's so suppressing it so hard. Like you get the sense that the more cruel that he is, the more he's suppressing what's really underneath. And another criticism that I can imagine in this is that it's not as deep or nuanced as it might seem, which I could see it, being a little too sort of like showing itself a little bit like there are cases where it could have been more subtle. But just the whole idea of the themes we have going here, I think, are strong enough that I don't mind if we're kind of, because there's stuff that's super, super subtle and nuanced, but then there's other stuff that's like totally not. But I feel like there's enough of a balance of that I'm not really mad at it if it wants to throw just like a huge clue out there, or a huge like one complaint that I heard specifically was the unsubtlety of putting Bronco Henry's initials on the sort of like handkerchief or whatever it is, the scarf, where we kind of put the pieces together already by then. But stuff like that doesn't really bring it down at all for me, because like I said, there's still cases where it's a little more. I guess it makes it a little more accessible, which is going to help its sort of overall success, I would hope. But still, the stuff here that's not really explained explicitly, which is a lot of it, like the whole thing where there's a whole thing. This is one of the discussions that's going to kind of take us all the way to the end, which is this whole obsession that Phil has with being just filthy constantly, and the idea that this is essentially his identity. Like, it's because obviously we learn early on that he implements come from money. When we see their interactions with their parents and stuff like that, they have the governor over at their house. And it's like, it's clear they come from this, wealthy existence, and this wasn't something they were just kind of born into. It was this whole relationship with Bronco Henry, this unseen dead character, that was a mentor and probably more to Phil, and how he basically, whether it be the whole idea of keeping Bronco Henry's spirit alive, or just a full-on identity crisis, Phil is keeping this alive and basically taking this on as his own identity, where he's the guy that's constantly dirty and is constantly working out there. And there's this whole scene where this is one of those cases where I knew I had to. This is one of the first instances where I knew I had to watch it a second time, and then ultimately a third. Was this whole scene where they make a huge deal, a huge dramatic deal, out of Clemens telling Cumberbatch, if you're gonna, come to dinner with our parents and the governor and his wife, you're gonna have to wash yourself off. But he really stretches out this request in a way. It's almost like he's asking Cumberbatch to do the most drastic thing you can possibly think of. Where it's it's like asking somebody for like $3 million or something. Where you're like really stretching it out, and it's like well, it would be really nice, and you don't have to, but it'd be really nice. And it just goes, and then it's like, if you would, wash up before you came inside. And and when you see that the first time, you're like, is that it's like how much is that asking exactly? But what he's essentially asking is for him to wash away this complete and total persona that he has put on up to this time. To basically go back to the old, just for a night, relive the fact that he comes from money and that he's not this dude that is constantly covered in filth and works out with the animals and all that stuff, does all the castrating and the skinning and stuff like that. And yet he's basically asking him to be an entirely different person, and abandon this whole facade that he has set up to this point. And then the whole thing that goes into about the mud baths that he has, where it's like it's almost like there's kind of a double meaning there, where it's like, first of all, it is the case of he's just constantly trying to make himself dirtier throughout it. Like, even when he's bathing, he's trying to make himself dirty. But then I guess there's kind of a double meaning in there somewhere, where there's that whole thing about how, I'm not sure how this works, but how mud can be cleansing in some sort of way, to where it's almost like you can see this internal battle or something, where it's like the cleaning versus filth kind of thing going on, where you can see the dueling parts of his mind. Though he's trying desperately to do this whole filthy persona. And then when you talk about things being revealed about Phil's character, because a very early scene is his first interaction with Cosmo McPhee. And Cosmo McPhee is clearly a gay character, and naturally Phil has the reaction you would expect from a character like Phil to this. And yeah, it could seem really cliche, that the most homophobic person in the room is probably the gayest, but that also feels, especially when you see stuff in politics where people who do all these anti-gay laws and stuff like that end up getting caught in certain situations, and it's weird. It feels weirdly true in a lot of cases, that's just a true thing. So to take that and see these reveals about Phil's character and how he's basically the opposite. So it's like talking about the fact that when he's suppressing his actual identity, there's multiple things that are being, it's not just a suppressing of I come from money, bringing on the whole macho persona and covering yourself in dirt and all that, and working constantly. Phil's suppressing a lot of things, and the fact that kind of comes in and you realize the multiple things that Phil is hiding, not just from everyone around him, but basically from his own. It's almost like he's trying to completely be consumed by this Bronco Henry personality, to get away from that whole thing. And then there's another layer about this whole Bronco Henry thing, and the fact that it's going somewhere, because it becomes pretty apparent pretty early throughout the movie that Phil wasn't just mentored by Bronco Henry. Clearly now he has a full-on obsession with him, to where everything is connected to Bronco Henry in some way whenever Phil is talking about pretty much anything. And how he has the saddle up and the whole remembrance thing and stuff like that. And at first you just think, wow, he's really obsessed with his mentor. But then you get into the whole thing of what exactly was Phil and Bronco Henry's relationship, and was it potentially unsavory? Because one of the very important questions in the movie is asked by Peter, the Cosmo McPhee character, where he says, how old were you when Bronco Henry was doing this stuff with you? And his response is about your age. and Coach McPhee is like 20 now, I think, but I think we're under the impression that Peter is younger, like kind of too younger in this particular context we're talking about. So then that brings in the whole thing also of, was there a sort of mutual relationship between Phil and Bronco Henry, or was it a grooming? And one of the, not only is that a very important question in regards to understanding Phil as a character and where he's coming from and what his backstory is, but now that he's taking on this relationship with Peter, who he initially sort of, shunned. And because there's the other thing where he's got the whole battle going on with Dunst, where he's getting inside Dunst's head and basically gaslighting her, finding like all of her sort of insecurities and bringing them out, and literally driving her to alcoholism and trying to make her go as insane as possible. So when he's dealing with her child, um, there's the thing of, does he see himself in him, especially with the gay aspect, and is he sort of taking him in as a mentor, or is it something more unsavory? And if it's unsavory, it could be for, if he's doing a grooming cycle here and he's continuing that, or given his relationship to Dunst and trying to do every bad thing imaginable to her without, like, doing it in very sort of subtle ways, just completely taking over her life and driving her insane. Um, is it going to be unsavory in that way? There's like so many possibilities of the directions we could be going here, and that's what the really intriguing aspects of the movie are. Um, and now you're just kind of constantly asking questions throughout it. And like I said, when I saw it the first time, I wasn't really asking any questions like this at all. And then by the second and third time around, it was like I had like 50 questions for every scene, which is really great. And that's the kind of stuff where I feel like it really enriches itself more and more the more you see it, and you'll probably have even more questions the next time than you did the previous time. Um, and for a movie to be able to keep doing that, because it can also seem like it can be a hindrance for a movie if you have too many questions. But I feel like there's plenty here where the movie answers a lot of questions, but there's also stuff to where it enriches it that you can fill in the blanks yourself and maybe give the questions your own answers. And while that might seem like a cop out from like a writing perspective, the fact that like any scenario sort of works, like I said, you can even look at, and you don't even necessarily have to pick one. You can see it as like all these things at once, because all things in life are like actually multifaceted and don't have one particular answer or one particular reason for that being the way that things were. Because like for all we know, maybe Phil did actually take a genuine liking to Peter, or it could have been unsavory, because there is the whole thing with the rope also, where it does feel like that, where he's practically in his dying moments and he just wants to get the rope to him. Feels very tragic, but it's still that thing of not knowing for sure where the Bronco Henry like sort of comparison, that parallel is happening, in what way. Because there's also the thing of, if Phil was groomed by Bronco Henry, that's something that he may, even in adulthood, still not be completely aware of, because that's the way that damage is done. And there's so much complexity here, is what I'm trying to say. And like so many different ways you can see these characters and how they approach each other, and what their relationships are. And it's like there's some that are clean cut, like it's clear that Cumberbatch is going after Dunst in a particularly predatory way, and there's really no ifs, ands, or buts about that. But then when you see the relationships with like him and Peter, then there's something. If there's like really the only limited interaction we have here is between Casey McPhee and Clemens. But there kind of starts to be a distance with Clemens as the movie goes on, before he kind of comes back in the later parts. But what's interesting about that also is the fact that as we start to see things more from Phil's perspective as the movie goes on, it is interesting the stuff that we see through his point of view that otherwise, might have been seen more up close and personal, because we get you know, these scenes with Clemens and Dunst and their romance and how this led ultimately to their marriage, like that. The dancing scene is very touching. But then once that's established, the really crucial parts of their relationship are seen only through Phil's perspective, which is interesting since Phil is so particularly cold to us in the opening scenes. But when we get these big moments in their relationship, the Dunst Women's relationship, like when they get married, it's we find out when Phil does after it's already happened, and then the first time they are in bed together in the house is seen entirely through Phil's perspective and his reactions to it. And then it's then where we can kind of see, like, it takes initially that coldness that we had to him and not sure where he's coming from, and it starts to gradually put us through his eyes. And then when we get to these points later where we're getting much more fleshed out ideas of all the characters, it feels balanced. It doesn't feel like one is more distant to us than another, despite some of these characters being, like, I guess as far as the audience feeling a distance from the characters, Peter is the one that we kind of had to just sort of figure out for ourselves, which is really interesting since Tracy McPhee is the one that's getting, like, so many awards for this at this point, because his performance is probably the most nuanced, maybe next to Plemons, but obviously Tracy McPhee has much more to work with than Plemons does here as regards to his character's place in the story, because there is the whole thing of he seems like, you know, just kind of this tortured soul at the beginning, and it's like what he hears from Cumberbatch is probably not the first time he's heard that, and we see him, like, you know, doing his using a hula hoop to take out his aggression, and they build up that, you know, he had that he has, like, this connection with his father, and this whole idea of him doing the surgeon thing kind of being that sort of last connection. And that seems like that, but then when we get to the whole rabbit scene, and we see just how very nonchalant he is about killing animals, and it's like, yeah, it makes sense that he's doing it for study purposes, but it's like he's just so almost like he's not there in regards to having the rabbit and treating it nicely, and then ultimately killing it for this. Like, see, Thomas and Mackenzie's reaction in particular kind of sets up, like, we're supposed to have some conflicting feelings about Peter, because it's like, yeah, we get that's what it's for, but it's still like you get the idea, and then as we learn later, this becomes quite apparent, that when you associate, you know, killing animals with no emotion, usually is the first sign of, like, psychotic tendencies. So the idea that kind of planting this seed, and after we've known Peter to kind of be this sort of, you know, seemingly passive person, like he finds just these little things that make him happy, like making the, you know, flowers out of paper and stuff like that. And then when we kind of start to go in that direction, they start planting these seeds of what Peter might be capable of as a just as a character in general. And as that comes into play, when we see what the outcome is with Phil's character, and the whole idea of the, you know, poison pelt, and the fact that it's when we see what happens in regards to how Phil gets taken out of this story and how it was ultimately to protect Dunst, it's you start to wonder just how far in advance this was planned, like how far in advance this was calculated, what he was going to do to stop Phil from ruining his mom's life, and how long was this plan going on? Where it's like when we see him, you know, take the hide off, and it's been foreshadowed already that it's essentially poison, when, like, the hide is diseased, or so it's like when he was doing it, then was the plan already coming into place, or was this a potential just in case thing or anything like that? And just the way the events fall into place when when that rabbit goes under the logs, and it's Phil and Peter together, and ultimately the moment that will eventually kill Phil when he gets the open wound in his hand. But this scene in particular kind of shows those tendencies again, and kind of brings the rabbit thing more forward, where it's like Thomas and Mackenzie and rabbits obviously go together for awards movies very well. But the idea that Phil says, hey, we used to, make noise to see how long it would take it to come out, and it's like, oh, well, that's kind of cruel. And then when when its leg gets damaged, and Phil says, like, oh, I guess it's time to put it out of its misery. We see how quickly Peter can do this, and completely emotionlessly he can do this. And it's like, in the moment, you're like, oh, there's Phil being his cruel self again, and then it's Peter that makes you, in this scene, that does something that makes you think, oh, this got really dark really fast. And in the way we kind of build that character, and the way we introduce those characters, that character's tendencies this way, is just so incredibly intriguing. So, and that's the thing too, is I find it really interesting, because obviously Cozy McPhee has to bring this very complex and nuanced character to life, which is incredibly difficult. But I do find it interesting that he's getting the awards attention that he has been getting, because I also feel like, and not to take anything away from this performance at all, but I feel like a lot of the strength in Peter also it comes in the writing. So I do find it very interesting that he's had as much award success as he's had, because it's far from showy. Like I said, the showiness of the performance, the showiness of the character really comes in the writing itself. So, but everything, just comes together so nicely here. And of course, we've got a score, Johnny Greenwood score, which we were talking about There Will Be Blood earlier, does have a lot of... It's not like it's the same score as There Will Be Blood, but it'll give you little reminders of There Will Be Blood in a way that's quite welcome. But in general, as talking about that also just in general, the use of sound throughout it is very interesting, where there'll be just, like, the way the chords hit in the score will hit you just in certain ways, like, even if it's just, like, one sound. And then there's, even taking out of the score, you talk about pre-existing music, there's the piano-banjo battle between Cumberbatch and Dunst that feels like this instantly memorable scene. Like, it's basically the scene that kind of feels, you can feel the movie taking a turning point into what it ultimately becomes. That's very interesting. And then there's just in general sounds throughout, like the spurs that Cumberbatch wears, where you can kind of hear him throughout, where he's kind of this constant looming presence, and that makes that pretty much literal in a really interesting way, and kind of gives that, sort of unconventional Western vibe, where it's like these are sounds that you associate with Westerns, but you feel like you're watching anything but a Western outside of the setting and the costumes and stuff like that. That's very interesting. And then there's this whole sort of thing that Peter has going on, this habit where he runs his thumb down a comb, and that sound also just really it seems like he's doing it to, like, calm himself, but yet the sound is so unsettling, and it's like that's almost the kind of thing you would expect out of a character that has potentially psychotic tendencies. It's like this sound that's otherwise unsettling is the one that's kind of his comfort place. And there's even that moment later where, Dunst asks him, have you ever heard a sound that just made you shudder? And it's like, yeah, if you've seen this movie, you're gonna have plenty of those, plenty of different ones. So all of that is really effective also. So yeah, so once you know kind of all that going in, there is this sort of constant sense of tension that you might not get entirely to its full extent the first time, or maybe even the second time. But the way just everything starts to unfold, there is eventually just this constant tension throughout that really comes through with the just the execution here in general. If there's one thing performance-wise I don't know if I'm completely into, it is Dunst is great in regards to her progression into this state that Cumberbatch puts her in. But she does have some later scenes that are a little bigger, and I don't know if she can quite sell them. There's the scene, like the star scene, might be a bit too, like, I mean, clear acting, I guess, and doesn't feel like completely immersed in the character, I guess. But it's still a tough part to play, and also, like I said, as it gets more showy, the more it goes on, and kind of making that transition from nuance to big, There's still definitely something in there. Like I said, as soon as I saw the performance, it was like, oh yeah, that's she'll be an awards contender just fine. Even not taking into account she kind of had buzz going in. This is the kind of stuff that gets awards attention, so that's great. Um, and we were talking about the sort of double meanings with the mud, and I guess the last thing we can touch on is the title, which is dropped on us at the very last minute. And the interesting thing that the title is also something that can have, a couple of meanings, which is great because that kind of seems like a theme throughout the movie. All these things that can mean this thing, but also mean this thing, but also mean this thing. And the idea of freeing Dunstan's character, and the idea of it could be obviously the first thing feels like it's Cumberbatch, of course, but then there's also the alcoholism itself, and just in general the sort of pain in general, because obviously they start in pain, having with her husband and Peter's father having already died before this started, after having gone down the alcoholism path himself, before suicide. So there's multiple ways you can look at the way they sort of, not just him freeing her and that whole theme being what would you do to protect your mother and stuff like that, but almost kind of freeing himself also, from all this stuff as well. So um, yeah. So is that more or less all the is that more or less all the things this movie has going on? Like I said, I feel like if I watch it again, I'm gonna see even more stuff, and I'll wish I hadn't done this video yet, and then we could have gone into that too. But in the meantime, I feel like this is what I take away from it for now. I don't know if I guess the only thing I didn't really touch on that I kind of wrote down here was the idea of like the way like talking about the fact that the whole big theme regarding Peter is protecting your mother and stuff like that, and how there's a sort of parent theme going on here, where we talk about Phil and his brother coming from money and their relationship with their parents and stuff like that, and the distance that's kind of there, at least on Phil's end for sure. But like nobody in this movie is referred to by mom and dad or mother and father. I think there might be two, but there's only one for sure that I can remember moment, where Peter refers to Dunst by mother instead of her name, and you kind of get that sense of I don't know if it'd be the damage that can be brought on by family, specifically parents, or what, and the distance where a distance can start there, and the fact that Phil had to find this figure in Bronco Henry that ultimately led to this character that he is now. That's one thing. One last thing I want to bring up about Phil also, is you can really see the tragedy of the character in the final moments, where we get that whole sequence, for his funeral, where he's been completely washed and they've shaved him, and when we see him in the casket, clean and shaved, he clearly looks like an entirely different person. And it's where you can kind of see the only way he was able to show off who he truly was again, was in death only. So that's kind of really where it's you go into the Phil stuff, and you kind of question at the beginning if you're ever going to be able to see Phil in a different way, given how cruel he is, particularly to the Dunst character. But yeah, there's definitely something really tragic in here. Like I said, especially if you want to take the Bronco Henry route, of what exactly that relationship was, and if Phil ever stood a chance once he met him. So that's pretty much what this has going on. So I feel like I could just end this video here, but there's actually two more things we got to talk about real quick, and I don't really know how much I can really add to these next two, but we can go into Lamb, which is one of the new A24 movies, and what is interesting right away about Lamb is you can kind of see A24 is this company that a lot of people love, including me, that's putting out a lot of really interesting stuff, distributing this stuff that otherwise might have never found a home anywhere, and it's like everything from Hereditary and Midsummer and The Lighthouse and stuff like that, sort of having its own sort of new horror genre, but also throwing out anything from awards contenders to really interesting indies and a lot of original stuff. Lamb essentially feels like pretty much every A24 movie in a blender. And whether that's a good or bad thing, I guess depends on where you're coming from. Because while A24 is certainly putting out a lot of these great movies, and a lot of these very artistic movies, it's I also feel like we're getting to a point where A24 could be something that would be very easy to parody, and that's a kind of a dangerous place to be in. And I do kind of I don't know exactly how much Lamb works for me, and especially in regards to others. And it's not like a genre kind of thing, because I know a lot of the problems people had with Lamb is it wasn't what they thought it was. They thought it was going to be like a horror movie or something. But that's the thing is I have that great this whole very helpful thing where I don't really look at any advertisements, try to look into things as little as possible. Because another movie that A24 put out back in 2017 was It Comes at Night. And It Comes at Night was one of my favorite movies of that year, and I love it. And I was surprised to learn that everybody hated it, but when I looked into it, I realized everybody hated it because it wasn't what they thought it was going to be. And so thankfully I don't have that problem by avoiding trailers and advertisements and stuff like that. So I didn't really have any idea what Lamb was at all, except that I did know that it was an A24 movie, and that's probably about it. I didn't know what exactly the title character was, so that was interesting to find out and gradually. What in like I was talking about before, this is a movie that does feel impossible to categorize, which is kind of its, I guess, ultimately its main selling point. If you want to take it from the approach of, no, it's not a horror movie, but there's unsettling elements in it, obviously. Like, especially the opening shots also feel like the opening shots of, like, an artistic horror movie, something like A24 would put out. But we've got the Iceland setting, there's very minimal dialogue, and we're getting to know these characters in pretty much silence by just watching them interact, where we get the idea that it's interesting that they're in a location that is so isolated because they're also, obvious symbolism. They seem very isolated from each other as well, and it's clear that they've had a personal loss in their life, specifically a child. And so the idea of them somehow getting a child into their life in the most unexpected possible way. And what's interesting about this also is when you introduce what's really unique about the way this movie approaches what it is that's going on is it could have easily tried to be a horror. It could have easily felt like a horror movie, and like I said, well, it does have those moments for sure where it does, especially the opening scenes, where there's just something just sort of generally ominous going on. Clearly, the introduction of the title character, where it's when we see this character, it could have been very easy to accompany this character with creepy music throughout. But no, it's treated quite lightly, actually, where it almost kind of feels like some sort of family drama, just in a very unconventional way, I guess you could say. This is one of those cases where I don't want to go into everything necessarily, but but at the same time I don't know what people know about this and what they don't, and what should be a surprise. But since we devoted all that time to Power of the Dog, I'll kind of dance around this a little bit because I don't really have a whole lot to say about Lamb. I wish I did, and it might be another one of those movies where if I saw it more than once, I might be able to really dissect what this scene means and what this scene means and all that. But it is very the problem where I don't feel Lamb is as intriguing as other movies like it, where you can dissect a whole bunch of other scenes and take a whole bunch of different meanings or whatever, is that it does feel very repetitive, and it's kind of frustrating because it's one of those movies where you can feel like it's on the verge of saying something, but then it's when it feels like it's right on the verge of sort of taking some profound direction or having something to sort of say about wherever you take the symbolism, it just kind of falls back into what it was. And a lot of that also is like I can get just kind of gradually it almost being like just watching a life happen for these people. It just in this, like I said, this very unconventional life. But it also kind of gets that's the cynicism that kind of starts to set in a little bit, and it's that whole thing of the idea of being a general what the fuck movie for the sake of being a what the fuck movie, where it's like you almost get the idea that they had a concept and they're like, put this concept in this setting and make it feel super grounded, and that would be like I think that there was some film festival where they got an award for originality, but it's almost like that was the intent, was for people to praise how original they are, but then there wasn't really much else after that idea. So we just kind of get these repetitive scenes going through, and I really wish I had been more hooked by it than I was, because there are, like, it doesn't even necessarily have to go into something super profound or have to go into some giant symbolic thing. It could literally just be us watching these lives happen, and it could be really intoxicating. I'm sure for many people it probably was. And some movies like that have really, really hooked me, and this one didn't quite. Like, and it was not even like I'm not even. I wasn't bored with it, but I just wasn't really intrigued by the possibility of what would happen next. And maybe it also comes into play that the story is ultimately very symmetrical, like almost to the point that maybe it's too symmetrical, where it's like it's. I mean, I would say you can kind of see where it's going, but that's also in a very general sense, where it's like you're not gonna quite know where it's going, but once it happens, it'll be like it's almost too neat, where it's almost like, oh yeah, yeah, I could get, okay, yeah, I could see where this is all tying together now, and then it just stops. And then it just kind of didn't really leave me with much of anything. And like I said, it almost feels like the intent is just to leave you with, oh, wasn't that fucking weird? Or go to your friends and say, you're never going to believe what I just watched, or something like that. And it feels very surface level to me, anyway. But maybe that's just me. But like I said, this is the kind of stuff where, I feel like the reason I feel comfortable feeling this way and not thinking like, oh, what didn't I see? Oh, I desperately need to go back to it, is that stuff like Lamb has really drawn me in before, and quite easy. Like when stuff like this draws you in, it's gonna happen early, and then you'll be with it, because it is one of those cases where movies like this, you're either with them or you're not. And I don't know that Lamb is one of those movies for me, but I can definitely see the appeal for sure, especially if you're into a lot of the crazy shit that A24 puts out there. Like I said, this is very A24, but like I said, A24 is also in a very dangerous place to where it could be, it starts to almost border on self-parody sometimes, and I feel like Lamb might have been a little closer to that. But I could definitely see people still taking to that in an interesting way, and kind of being drawn, just kind of hypnotized by the world that they set up. It's minimal, but it also feels like grand in its own way. Also, for a story that is so sort of small, there's definitely something interesting here. Like, I'm not just sort of throwing Lamb away, but I just wish that I was more into it than I was. So there's that. So let's end on Mass. Another movie that I don't really have a shitload to say about, because essentially the whole movie is essentially one scene, which is great. At its center, we have, like, sort of beginning scenes and ending scenes that are a little different. But as far as it being, the set in one room with only 4 characters and the dialogue that takes place. First off, going right in, if you're going to have this movie where you have characters in one room and it's all dialogue, the 12 Angry Men approach, I guess you could call it, it's going to have to be the setup that's really tricky. You got to have a setup that's, like, really going to, like, for all the dialogue that's about to transpire for the next hour and 45 minutes, there has to be something to talk about for that entire hour and 45 minutes. and you have to get to that point in the concept stage, where what is the discussion that's going to be going on here, where the story can sustain itself in one room for an hour and 45 minutes. And as soon as I read what this was about, I really wanted to see this movie. And the thing about that, though, is that what's really interesting is when the movie began, I love the way it's set up, because we're at this church and we see the preparation for our main characters to arrive, and we see it through the perspective of these people. But they're being very cryptic about why these characters are coming and what it is they're going to be talking about. And when I was watching these scenes, I was already so drawn into it that I wish I didn't know what the characters were there for and what they were going to talk about, because I love the way they kind of built up to it, and we're seeing it through these characters' perspectives that don't really have much of an idea what's going on, and what they do know, we as the audience only get through some vague details. Like, we know something drastic has happened, that's bringing these four people together, and something that has been like something that goes beyond these four people. Like, it's that big. And it's like just the way they build that up through these characters. Like, I could have watched like at least an hour of these people just building up to this meeting and setting it up. But then, yes, of course, the main draw being when our four characters get here. Sorry, excuse me. Two couples, Reed Birney and Ann Dowd, and then Jason Isaacs and Martha Plimpton. And this discussion that they're having where one of them are the parents of a school shooter and the others are the parents of one of the victims in that. And then arguing and debates and a lot of discussion ensue about where we go from this and how we approach these kind of tragedies. And the main problem with this is that this is one of those discussions where I'm assuming Frank Kranz had this in mind at this point where we are now. This would have been an interesting movie in any place, because if it was like, 20 or so years ago, where we barely seemed to see this kind of thing, where it wasn't like, these big things in the news, it would be really interesting, and it'd be like, the tragedy would be really hard-hitting in this way of like the shock of this kind of thing happening. But now that this movie was made today, where it feels like every other day, to the point that we are like so tragically desensitized to hearing news like this, where it's like, oh yeah, that happened again, and oh, it's another day, another one of these. It feels just as important for a movie like this to exist and discussions like this to exist. And maybe even more so, since to kind of bring us back to the reality of every time this happens, like like you may see it on TV or in passing, or on like a news website or something, and it's like, oh yeah, that again. But it's like every time that happens, we have these situations where people are dead, and people are having discussions like this, and people are feeling this kind of pain that the characters in this movie are feeling. And one thing that's really great that there was like an indie sort of actors panel recently, and Ann Dowd was talking about the fact that apparently the studio was trying to push Frank Kranz to write in flashback scenes, and first of all, that's just dumb. I'm so glad that he kind of put his foot down and said that's not what this movie is, and it kind of takes away from the whole movie's concept to do that. And I was discussing, I was like, you do realize that if Mass had flashback scenes in it, every single review for this movie would have said the exact same thing, me included. It would have been, the movie is fantastic, the movie is great, the performances are incredible, the only setback is the stupid flashbacks. That's exactly what every single review would have looked like if they had forced that on him any further, and he would have had no choice but to go along with it. This is the movie this is what people would want this movie to be, is never leaving this room, and only dealing with the discussions, and seeing these people interact. What's really interesting about it being in such a limited location also is the camera always has to be somewhere. So the camera typically will always have to be on somebody. So like nearly every shot of this movie is either somebody having a monologue or a reaction shot. And the thing about it is, because of the places these parents are coming from, you're never quite sure who the reaction shot is going to land on. Like, it could be, one of the other couple, or it could be the person married to the person that's talking. You never quite know where the camera's going to land next, and how that person's going to be reacting to whatever is being said or whatever's being discussed. And that in itself is kind of just this constant raised tension, especially when you look at the fact that Jason Isaacs and Martha Plimpton are the parents of the child that was one of the victims. And so they're the ones that are coming from like a place of anger. So it's like anytime it cuts to them, or anytime there's the possibility that the camera's about to cut to one of them, it always feels intense. It always feels like you're never quite sure when, like, you're like, it gets to the point where it gets so tense you're almost begging one of them to have an outburst, because it's like you just know it's just something that's just boiling and boiling, and it's like just you need that release just so you don't go insane, so you as an audience member don't have to leave the room out of discomfort. And that's the feeling that you want out of a movie like this. Like, you want, that's the stuff that you like. It's one of those things where, like, the more unbearable it is, the more you almost want to keep that feeling, because the movie's doing its job so well, and the performances especially are doing their jobs so well. Because obviously they're all kind of getting a lot of praise here, particularly Isaacs and Ann Dowd. And like I was talking about before in our awards videos, the very interesting thing about the fact that Isaacs and Dowd are the more notable performers. They're all four equally notable, of course, but I mean, with Isaacs and Dowd specifically, we have Isaacs almost kind of being the face of the anger, and Dowd kind of being the face of the pain, and how Dowd is completely downplayed throughout the movie, and Isaacs is going to be a bit bigger and more showy. They all have moments. They all have big moments, and they all have downplayed moments. But as far as like the general sense of these characters, and it's without going into like them just being those particular character types. Like I said, the movie is much more subtle than that, and the performances are much more subtle than that. But there are these things that eventually are going to have to come to light. Like, you could have a movie that's like, oh, we're going to be totally completely downplayed. We're not going to be a movie of big acting and big outbursts and stuff like that. But it's like, if you were to eavesdrop on this situation, that's going to happen at some point. Where it's like, if this movie was like 150,000% downplayed, it would have felt too staged. And if it was too big, it would have felt too staged. So Korean's really found this sort of middle ground here, where it's like, people are downplayed at just the right time, and they get angry and big at just the right time, and emotional at just the right time. And that had to be, I can't imagine the kind of high wire act that must have been, especially in the writing process, before you even had, actors together here. But all these people, especially with people like Reed Bruner, who are mainly known for, like, the stage, that's the kind of thing you want. Because this is definitely a movie where, if, like, anybody that goes into this not knowing any better will probably already assume that it's like a play first, when it isn't, as far as I know. But it probably will be. Like, this will be one of those cases like stuff like Swimming with Sharks, where it's like it was a play first, or it was a movie first, and then they started making, like, play productions out of it. This could very easily be one of those. Like, you could just use the script directly. You don't even have to change anything, and you have a play here. Which is really great. Like, you see, like in theater groups or acting classes or stuff like that, when people have to pick monologues, I could easily see monologues from this movie being used and being chosen. It's yeah, and then the whole idea of how it feeling very human and grounded and not staged, and the idea that it obviously, with the whole school shooting angle and the guns angle, it more like the thing you'll notice in real life constantly is, it feels like the reason nothing gets resolved as far as like moving towards anything is it becomes a political discussion, and then when you bring politics into it, one person goes one way, one person goes the other way, and they just leave it at that. And that could have been what this movie was. But that's the thing also, where it's like, if they had gone like I can imagine Aaron Sorkin having written this in a completely different way, where it would have felt very big and very staged. But the fact that it kind of focuses on the human moments and that stuff kind of comes up periodically, but there's not a lot of like they don't stay on it necessarily, makes it feel much more real. And I said like where it feels like you're eavesdropping, which is the kind of really important feeling you kind of got to have throughout this movie for it to really draw you in and feel really believable. Is you have to feel like you're eavesdropping on a real conversation between these very real people. And it's like even though you've seen Jason Isaacs in a million things, Martha Plimpton in a million things, and Ann Dowd, um, you stop seeing actors really early on, and you see grieving parents and guilt parents that are consumed by guilt and a lot of questions, and a lot of pain. And so that's really all this movie really had to accomplish, was bringing in those real feelings and those real emotions and make it feel like you're watching real people to a degree kind of even more amplified than you would typically. Because obviously you go into a drama, you want everything to feel real and you want the people to feel like real people. But here in particular, like it really just has to come off the screen in this really strong and powerful way without being too big and showy and actory. And that they were all four able to accomplish that, and Cranes was able to accomplish that as the writer and director. Is yeah, and coming from and Frank Kranz being such a comedic actor, for the most part, at least most of the stuff I've seen him in, this was yeah, it's usually like comedic people that can easily go to the most serious places. This is incredibly impressive, as far as like not just the direction and the acting, but the writing in particular. Like really, like it's yeah. I mean, him being nominated in the screenplay would be great if it wasn't such a crowded year. But if that did happen, that would be amazing. So, um, yeah. So I guess that's what we have talked about now. So we will continue to do more of this kind of stuff. We're going to talk about West Side Story and Belfast next, and then go into Spencer and probably into some more foreign movies and Passing the Humans. There's so much stuff. The animated movies. Yeah, we'll go into that. We'll go into all that stuff, and we've got more award stuff coming also. So yeah, we'll get through all these releases, and then we'll do some end of the year lists with the best and worst, and see where we are with those. So until the next thing, I think that's it.